It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Awesome.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege to interview the sports podcast owner of Pod of Fame. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Brandon. How about you?
I'm doing good. Can you talk about how you knew that you wanted to start a Hall of Fame sports podcast?
Sure, yeah. So last year, back in kind of March and April when the whole world shut down, can't believe it's almost coming up on a year here. We couldn't do too much. Everyone is stuck in their homes, and I started up a group chat with some of my high school friends, and we all have very common interests, sports being a main driver of our topics. And to kind of pass the time away every day, I would throw out a topic of the day. We just called it our daily sports question, and it could be about anything. Top 5 point guards of the 90s, best running backs of the 2000s, 21st century, things like that. Anything we could think of. And then this would drive like 300, 400 texts throughout the day of us talking about different players from that era, who was good. Like, I can't believe I forgot about this guy. We would go back and forth with all of that. And eventually it kind of came to me like, this is so fun. We love talking about all these old players, people we forgot about. And then Hall of Fame discussions would get brought up all the time. Like, how is he not in, or is he in yet, or will he get in? And after all that, I was like, you know what? I know we're not the only ones that talk about this, because if you watch any TV shows, like I watch Pardon the Interruption every day with Michael Wilbon and Tony Kornheiser. Every day almost on that show, the Hall of Fame will be brought up at some point. And it's not just like who's going to get in the Hall of Fame. It's just like this Hall of Famer or this ex-player, will he get in the Hall of Fame? Or if anyone retires, if they're pretty good, like when Philip Rivers retired, right? They're like, is he a Hall of Famer? It actually gets brought up all the time, and you just don't really always think about it. So I thought, there's a market for this. So I kind of put together a framework of how the podcast would work. We launched last July, and we've been picking up a solid audience now for the last several months, and we're really catching on. And what I've seen from the interaction, whether it be with my podcast or with my Twitter account, there's a lot of people that have some very serious thoughts about the Hall of Fame, and they definitely don't always agree with what I'm saying. But it's a fun way to talk about old players. It's a great way to be able to just talk about people maybe we forgot about.
That's amazing. How did you come up with the name for your podcast, Pod of Fame?
Yeah, so again, I would love to take credit myself, but it was really my group chat with these guys we started with. I kind of pitched them the idea. I was like, do you think this would work? Do you think people would be interested? Everyone was like, that would be pretty fun idea to do. And then I started throwing around different names, and we knew we wanted it to be short. We knew we wanted to somehow make sure people understood it was about the Hall of Fame. And Pot of Fame was super short. It was kind of catchy. And again, it had that fame in there that we needed. So it wasn't that long of a naming process in my memory. There's a couple names we were going back and forth with, but I think Pot of Fame really stuck. And honestly, I'm very, very happy with it. It kind of rolls off the tongue, and it's short and sweet, I feel like.
What are some of the segments that you have on your podcast?
Yeah, so the podcast is set up. There's 4 segments we run through every week, and we release every Monday. The first segment is called What Comes to Mind. So it's pretty self-explanatory, right? When you think of a certain player, what's the first thing that's going to pop into your mind? It can be anything. And we get some pretty crazy answers with that one, that's for sure. Then we go into that memorable moment. So we feel, at Pot of Fame, if someone is a Hall of Famer, they should at least have one super memorable moment of their career. If we ever have trouble in that segment, it's already kind of leaning toward maybe that person's not a Hall of Famer. Because if you don't have a memorable moment, should you really be in the Hall of Fame? And then the third segment is called And Twins. And that's where we take a look at someone who's in the Hall of Fame already. And we try to say, whoever we're talking about that day, if we were trying to find someone that's very similar, they're twin in the Hall of Fame today, who would that twin be? So we kind of compare those two people back and forth. And finally, the last segment, which usually takes up the majority of our time, it's called a court. So this is where we really lay out the case for that candidate and the case against. And at the end of court, we decide whether or not we feel like they should be in the Hall of Fame.
Who are some of the people that you think, like, as they're playing right now, would be in the Hall of Fame if they would retire right now?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. So who's playing right now? Well, this is a cheat question, and he's probably just at the top of my mind. But obviously, Tom Brady, if he retired 6 years ago, he would have been in the Hall of Fame already. But that's too easy. So let me think of someone else that's maybe not as obvious. I guess like someone like Russell Westbrook, right? I think Russell Westbrook is only 31. He'll probably play another 6 or 7 years. But if Russell Westbrook retired today, he's in the Hall of Fame, right? He averaged a triple-double 2 different seasons. He has an MVP award. He has a number of All-NBA team honors. And then someone like Kevin Durant, right? Like when Kevin Durant got injured in the finals a couple years ago, it looked like, he looks like he's great again, but let's say he never comes back after that injury. Even if he never comes back, he gets hurt in the finals, he never comes back, he's in the Hall of Fame, right? He's got multiple championships, scoring titles, an MVP. Kevin Durant, someone we know is in the Hall of Fame. What we try to take a look at Pot of Fame a little more is someone who's more on the fence, like a Draymond Green, right? He has 3 championships with the Warriors, but he's never been like a top scorer. He's never going to be really an MVP. But he's a really great player for a number of championship teams. So he's someone who's going to be on the border, I think, when he retires, and someone I definitely do a podcast episode. Phillip Rivers, right, also just retired. I think he's a great podcast episode. So I try to stay away from the super obvious people like Peyton Manning. We don't need to really talk about whether he should be in the Hall of Fame. We knew that. But then someone else like, Calvin Johnson, right? He got in this year. But I did an episode on him because, he retired super early. I didn't know if he deserved to be in right away. I think we can all agree Calvin Johnson was a great wide receiver, but he retired really early and his career numbers don't really stack up against a lot of Hall of Famers. So I was actually surprised he got in right away. I think the name recognition helps a lot, but he was someone I thought an episode he deserved one because he was a great player. I just didn't think he played long enough to maybe be a first ballot Hall of Famer. But I was wrong there because he just got in the other week when they announced the Hall of Fame for the Football Hall of Fame last Saturday.
Of course, whenever they do that, do you know beforehand who are some of the people that you want to talk about? Like, for example, let's say Todd Gurley, who, in my opinion, I think he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, but I know everybody doesn't think he does. What are some of your ideas on that?
Yeah. Todd Gurley is a great call, Brandon, and definitely down the road when Todd Gurley retires, that is someone I will want to do because right at his peak, he was one of the best running backs in the game, and his touchdown numbers at the end of the day will probably be up there. But yeah, people are going to say he only had a few really great seasons, and other than that, depending on when he retires, how many yards he accumulates, he'll probably be a tough sell. In terms of how I look, I use my own best judgment. Like I talk to enough people in the industry, whether it be Hall of Fame voters themselves or people that cover the team, where we have a good idea of if someone is likely to be in the Hall of Fame or if they're more borderline. And based off those conversations I have and just my general knowledge of the sport itself, I can kind of have a good idea of, who would make a good episode and maybe who we wouldn't stay away from. To be honest, though, my philosophy around that is if anyone out there thinks someone should be a Hall of Famer, I think it's worth the discussion. Like, you're not going to bring up the bench player, the 9th guy in the bench who barely plays in a basketball game, or the backup running back his whole career for the Hall of Fame. But even if, like, most fan bases, right, if you really root for a team, you love certain players, and to you they're a Hall of Famer. Maybe to everyone else they're not, but I think almost everyone deserves an episode at some point if they even, made an all-star team or two or had some good runs or meant a lot to a fan base. I think they at minimum deserve an episode. I'm I'm pretty easy in terms of who can get an episode, but I'm not as easy on who should actually get in the Hall of Fame.
Who are some people that you have interviewed?
Yeah, so again, I've interviewed a lot of people, whether it be from the people who actually vote for, the Football Hall of Fame, the Baseball Hall of Fame, the Basketball Hall of Fame, to, best-selling New York Times best-selling authors, to the journalists. Some notable people I'll just mention, I'm from Chicago. I've grown up here my whole life, so I'm a big Chicago sports fan. I grew up reading the newspaper at a really early age, just the sports section, though. I didn't start reading the full newspaper until probably I was after college, but I always read the sports section probably from the age of 5 or 6 up. And in my household in Chicago, we were a Chicago Sun-Times household, which is one of the two big papers in Chicago. The Tribune's the other. And Rick Tellender was the main columnist for the Sun-Times sports section. If you open the sports section, he's one of the main columns there. And I had him on a few months ago to talk about Steve McMichael, who was part of the 1985 Bears. And I was trying to, not act like a huge nerd on the call, but I mean, I had grown up reading this guy from the age of 6. So he was a hero of mine in terms of people that cover sports. And it was an honor to really have him on. And I tried to play it cool, but I ended up telling him later on, I've read you since I was 6. I hope it didn't freak him out, but I've been reading him for over 20 years. So I thought that was really neat to talk to him. I also talk, again, I'm a Chicago guy, but Sam Smith, he wrote The Jordan Rules, which is, I think, one of the most famous basketball books out there about, Michael Jordan and how teams would try to stop Jordan. And Sam Smith, again, he covered the Bulls for the Tribune for, I think, 30 plus years. He's a big name in Chicago. So to have him on, we talked about Horace Grant, who was on those 90s Bulls teams. Talking to him was really cool. And then again, Football Hall of Fame voters, talked to a few just last month because the Hall of Fame vote was coming up. I talked to Dave Burkett from, he's the Detroit Lions kind of Hall of Fame voter. I talked to Sam Kavaris. He's out of Jacksonville. So he's a Hall of Fame voter. Gary Myers is a Hall of Fame voter. So those Hall of Fame voters, those people that are in the room, they're always super interesting to talk to, and especially the Football Hall of Fame. The Baseball Hall of Fame, there's over 300 voters, but for football, there's only 48 people in the room. So it's really tight-knit. It's a really small group of people. So hearing the inner workings of those meetings and what's talked about, I always find that super interesting. So any of those Hall of Fame voters I've had on recently, really interesting to hear their thoughts on what goes on in there and what's discussed.
Can you talk about, of course, how you get in contact with people that are Hall of Fame voters?
Yeah, definitely. So it's, I just reach out to them, via email or via common contacts. Like when I first started off, right, I was kind of building up the network there, but now that I have talked to a number of Hall of Fame voters across the different sports, and we do cover basketball, baseball, and football on the podcast, a lot of them, recommend other people that they know in the industry, that they know really love that player. So I will say in the very beginning, you got to build up that contact base. But after a while, at this point, it's really recommendations, or they can point me in the right direction of who covered that certain player, who has a good relationship with that player, and then I can get even more insight there. But I will be honest, most of these people out there, they're super happy to talk about, the Hall of Fame, about the players themselves. It's fun. It's almost a trip down memory lane because, their jobs today, most of them, other than the ones that are retired, they have to talk about who's playing today, right? What's going on today. So when I can get them on the phone or on a call and we can talk about someone they haven't thought of in, 20 years, or if we're talking about, Andre Kurlenko from the Jazz, they probably haven't thought about Andre Kurlenko in 10 years, or Sam Cassell or Steve McMichael. I mean, he retired in the early 90s. That's almost 30 years ago now. They don't get to talk about those players much, but they have great memories of those players. And they seem to really like to open up about that and talk about those players that maybe have fallen off the radar, but were fun to cover back in the day.
Who are some memorable Hall of Famers that you've talked about their career?
Yeah. So, players I really found interesting, and honestly, I pick out all my topics pretty much. I mean, some of them are more timely than others. If they're in the news, I can do a thumb up, but all these players I found pretty interesting. But like lately, doing one on Calvin Johnson. I mean, he was one of the best receivers of the 2010s and one of the biggest freak athletes of all time. So talking about him was a lot of fun. Talking about players, like I grew up a big baseball fan. So talking about players like Gary Sheffield and Mark Burley, I had a lot of fun on that. But to be honest, like we don't. I'll talk about players from the 70s and players that just retired a few years ago. Like, and that's I think the most fun part, especially when I'm talking to some of these people. They'll bring up other players, and I'll be like, "Wow, like I haven't thought about that person in a while. That could be a fun episode, or they should be in the Hall of Fame." But one of my favorite people I did, who just got elected, actually, is Drew Pearson. Um, I learned about Drew Pearson off some. I was actually reading about. I read a lot about sports, a lot of books. Like if you look at my bookshelf, it's 80%, 90% sports books. But I love looking back at old time periods of the NFL because the NFL has changed so much from when it got started to now. And especially with how, today it's a passing league, but in the past it was really a defensive league, a running league. And I was looking in the 1970s, I was reading about Roger Staubach, the Hall of Fame Cowboys quarterback. Everyone knows that name. But they were talking about his top receiver, who was Drew Pearson. And Drew Pearson was not in the Hall of Fame yet. And Drew Pearson was his top wideout in the 70s and one of the best wideouts in the 70s in general in the NFL. But no one talks about Drew Pearson much because when you look at his numbers, they're not that exciting compared to today's wide receivers. But that's because back in the 70s, you could lead the league in receiving with like 800 yards receiving. They just didn't pass the ball that much. So his statistics don't look great by today's standards, but for his time period, he was one of the best receivers in the 70s. And he's been waiting to get in the Hall of Fame forever. I mean, he retired I believe he retired maybe early 80s, and he just got in this year in 2021 finally. But he's been waiting years and years and years to get in. So doing his story, talking about his career with a Hall of Fame voter, it was just really great to tell that story. And then he got in this year. Now, did our podcast have any input there? Probably not. But we talked with one of the Hall of Fame voters. It got his story out there more to the masses, and he got in this year, and it was super. I saw when he got in, he was crying. Like it was just super. It was great to hear this guy who I got to talk about with the Hall of Fame voter actually get in at the end of the day, and it was well deserved. So Drew Pearson's probably one of my favorite ones he did, just because I didn't know too much about him before I started kind of researching for the podcast. But after talking to Gary, who covered Drew Pearson, knows Drew Pearson, and learning more about his career, it was just someone who is well deserved to get in, and I'm just happy to see him in the Hall of Fame now.
That's so amazing that you did an interview with him, with talking about him and stuff, and he actually got in this year. What are some future plans with the Pod of Fame?
Yeah. So again, future plans of the Pod of Fame. Our viewership continues to go up every week, which is great. Our Twitter following continues to go up, which is great because it gives me ideas for who we should do here. And I'm always going to continue, doing episodes every Monday on a player who is eligible for the Hall of Fame, who, is up for discussion, who's maybe a debatable person. The one other route I want to take this down the line is I do want to start interviewing at some point people who are already in the Hall of Fame, Hall of Famers themselves, and talk a little more about, I talked about Brandon earlier, the segments. I would have to change it up a little bit. And I wouldn't do this all the time, but every so often, but change it more about, what their career, like tell me about their career, maybe talk about some of the key moments that, most people know about and what it felt like, to become a Hall of Famer. And then also like talk about more today's game, relate more to what we're seeing today. How would they translate in today's game? Who do they like? Who reminds me of them? I think that's a way that I can draw a little more, more people into the pod, because right now it's all sports history, right? It's talking about stuff that's happened in the past. A lot of people like to talk about what's happening today, which I understand. So having more being able to draw more fans in that only follow today with people from the past is somewhere I would like to eventually get. I always want to keep the former athletes, the journalists, the Hall of Fame voters. I always want to bring them on to talk about players from the past. But I think it would be cool to every so often have a couple maybe weeks of the year where I bring in past Hall of Famers and talk about their career. And then also, in the same token, I even want to do a couple specials every year where I talk about someone who's already in the Hall of Fame today and I just break down their career. Because, I started this podcast just last July. I would love to do a podcast on Shaq's career. Shaq has a super interesting career to me. I'd love to break it down and just talk about his career and death. There's someone like Kevin Garnett who's already in. Some of my favorite players who are already in the Hall of Fame, but I would love to talk about anyway, just because I watched them play so much. I love them so much. They were automatic Hall of Famers. But still, I think some people like taking deep dives sometimes, especially when they've forgotten how great a player was so many years ago. So that's some different directions I could see the pod going in the future. We're always going to stay true to our formula right now, but I think there's room to do a couple extra kind of specials down the line.
So amazing. What is something that you learned now that you didn't know before starting?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Brandon. One thing I want to call out now, my whole life's been dedicated to sports. I don't have to do that much research going into these pods for the most part because I followed these players. I know these players. Some I have to do a little more than others. But one player I had to do a bit of research about that I didn't know much of anything about was Steve Tasker. Brandon, do you know who Steve Tasker is?
No.
Okay, exactly, right? So Steve Tasker is a former Buffalo Bill special teamer. And that's what, like, he was a special teamer. That's it. He wasn't a kicker or a punter or really a kick returner or a punt returner. He did a little kick returning, punt returning, but not really. What his only job was on the field was to like run down on punt returns, run down on kick returns, and tackle the player. He was a special teamer through and through. But he is beloved by Buffalo Bills fans. And he actually was a semifinalist for the Hall of Fame this year. He didn't get in, but he was a semifinalist just by being a gunner. Because people say, and it's like not really debated, he's the best special teamer gunner of all time. So I didn't know much about him, but I had read all about this. Like, that's super interesting, right? If you're that good, but you really don't have a position, you're just a special teamer, that's an afterthought. How is he a semifinalist? So I did a bunch of research. I had someone on, Lindsay D'Arcangelo from The Athletic on, who's a big Buffalo Bills supporter, and she covers the team. So it's a double whammy there. And we talked about Steve Tasker. And the one thing in my research and talking to Lindsay we couldn't get over is that Steve Tasker, a gunner, won the 1993 Pro Bowl MVP award. So he was in the All-Star game for the NFL, a football All-Star game. He's a special teamer, and he won the MVP award in that game, which is incredible. That will never happen again. I can tell you right now, Brent, that will never, ever happen again. And I think he blocked a field goal, and he forced a fumble and recovered a fumble in that game. It had like 3 tackles, and he turned the tide of that game because I think the fumble he forced, or no, I think he blocked a punt that led to a touchdown, and he forced a fumble. Yeah, those are the 2 things he did. So he did those 2 things, had 3 tackles, got the MVP award. That is incredible. That is something I never knew before I started this pod. And it's honestly one of the most interesting facts I've come across in the last probably year or so.
That's so amazing. What advice would you give upcoming future sports podcasts that are looking to do the Hall of Fame talks?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would have to say you have to have a passion for this stuff, right? Like, it's again, it'd be a lot of work if I didn't have any working knowledge off this, or if I didn't just love watching sports and I hadn't watched it for the last 30 years. I mean, this is a huge passion of mine. So like before I even started the pod, things like, NFL reference, NBA reference, MLB reference, right? Or football reference, basketball reference, baseball reference. Wow, I just generalize them. That's how they are. That's what they are online. I used to go on deep dives on those sites for hours just for fun because I'd be like, oh, this player. And then I link, anyone that knows what listening today that knows what I'm talking about, right? You start researching one player, it leads you to another. You start I love to do that stuff. I was doing that. I was gaining all that knowledge for no reason at all. Now I have a platform to talk about this stuff in a constructive way that can actually be enjoyed by other people instead of me just having all that internal knowledge inside. I love reading. I love doing that research. It's a big part of my life. I love history. I love sports. So this podcast is a combination of that. And the Hall of Fame is really talking about past players. So, I would say if you were ever thinking of doing something similar to this, you better have a strong background in sports history. You have had to have read probably over 100 books on sports, and then really be willing to do those deep dives, find things that are interesting. Like a lot of players know, a good amount of the players I talk about, right? They know a lot about Calvin Johnson, but finding out, what's the best play Calvin Johnson ever did, or actually ranking Calvin Johnson among the best players of the 21st century, you better have some background working knowledge of all of this. Because if you didn't, it would take you 20, 30 plus hours to prepare for one podcast, and no one's going to do that. So I would say have a working knowledge, but also just have a strong passion for it. I have a blast every podcast I do. It's definitely not ever considered work at any point. So I would just say you have to have a strong passion and want to really, maybe continue what you do in your free time on a podcast. If it's not something you do in your free time already, whether it be reading all the time or going on those deep dives on those reference accounts, it's going to be tough for you because you really got to love this stuff to be able to do it on a reoccurring basis.
That's great advice. Where can my listeners find your podcast on social media and podcast platforms?
Sure. So podcast platforms, we're available pretty much anywhere you can get a podcast. We usually advertise on, Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Those are the two big ones, but really we're available on, I think, 9 or 10 different platforms. I couldn't name you all 10, but if you search us, you're probably going to find us. And then, on Twitter, we're pretty active on there. We're always advertising our next episodes or just talking about what's going on in the world today. And that's at Pod of Fame. So pretty easy to find us there as well. So both of those are kind of how you find us, either on Twitter or, for the actual podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Thank you again, Jimmy, for your interview, and best of luck with the Pod of Fame.
Of course, Brandon. Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Facebook at Brandon Sports Talk, Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Jimmy, for your interview, and best of luck.
Thanks, Brandon. Take it easy.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.